Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the central topics that is getting addressed in Camus' first of his letters to a German friend is whether or not he loves his country and what the love of country actually means and requires. And I think one of the places we should begin is not actually at the beginning, but a good ways into it. This is towards the very end of the letter. He tells us, I am tempted to tell you that it so happens that we are fighting for fine distinctions. In French, nuance, and that's a term that we have in English. Usually when we say that something is nuanced or that there's nuances to something, we do mean something like fine distinctions, distinctions that are not merely academic, but are unlikely to be recognized by people who are used to grosser, larger, easier to spot distinctions, and which might go without being noticed by people for that reason. And he tells us that these are the kind of distinctions that are as important as man or humanity himself. So what are these? He's going to give you a few of them here, but we're going to see him developing these distinctions throughout the letter. He says we're fighting for the distinction between sacrifice and mysticism. The Germans on the side of mysticism, the French on the side of sacrifice. Between energy or force and violence. The Germans for violence, the French for energy. Between strength and cruelty, right? Between the even finer distinction between the true and the false, between the man of the future and the cowardly gods you revere. So these are some pretty important distinctions. You might say, these are not fine distinctions. Yes, but in war and in the lead up to war, these can easily get lost. And so many who would give lip service to these show by their actions that they don't recognize these distinctions. So now we come back to this question, well, what does it mean to love one's own country? And he begins with this vignette. You said to me, the greatness of my country is beyond price. Anything is good that contributes to its greatness. And in a world where everything is lost its meaning, those who, like us young Germans, are lucky enough to find a meaning in the destiny of our nation must sacrifice everything else. And Camus says, I loved you then, but at that point we diverged. No, I told you, I cannot believe everything must be subordinated to a single end. There are means that cannot be excused, and I should like to be able to love my country and still love justice. I don't want any greatness, just any greatness for it, particularly a greatness born of blood and falsehood. I want to keep it alive by keeping justice alive. You retorted, well, then you don't love your country. Now, this is something that goes far beyond the scope of just French people and German people in World War II. I mean, this can apply in so many times. Should we love our country in such a way as to be willing to sacrifice anything for it, including goodness or justice? Or do we have to hold our country to certain standards? And so this is part of the question. What does it mean to love one's own country? And Camus says, I didn't love my country if pointing out what is unjust in what we love amounts to not loving. Now notice the if there. That's not one that Camus buys into. But he also understands that a lot of people are drawn to that. My country, right or wrong, right? Camus is saying, well, if it's wrong, then your country is not great, and you shouldn't be loving those aspects of your country. In insisting that what we love should measure up to the finest image of her. Another thing that some people might say, well, you don't love your country. So this could apply to French, Germans, Americans, Chinese. Pick anybody you want. Is your country going to be held to standards? Are you going to insist that it measure up? Camus is going to suggest to us that if you don't take that approach, you don't really love your country. And even how much you may say that you do or think that you do, it's not true love. And so he goes on and he says, we're going to meet again if possible, but our friendship will be over. You will lovingly remember your former victory with all your crushed might. Today I'm close to you in spirit, your enemy to be sure, but still a little your friend, because I'm not withholding anything from you here. I want you to leave you a clear idea of what neither peace nor war has taught you to see in the destiny of my country. And he says, when we talk about greatness, grandeur in French, there's two kinds of it that we could be talking about. There's the kind that the German friend is appealing to. There's the kind that Camus is appealing to. So one of these would be, as he says, the ability to do violence when you've been preparing for it for years, and when violence is more natural to you than thinking. What it is that the Germans under the Nazi regime have not just done, but made of themselves. That's one way of being great. You can conquer France, as they did, very luckily, as it turns out, that the French general staff, was hostile to using radios, and that they underestimated the rapidity with which they could be attacked, and gave in because the German generals were very, very worried about what was going on. But, the Germans managed to keep things going for a while. Camus is going to say there's another kind of greatness that is greater, the kind of greatness that keeps us going. And he says this amounts to telling you what kind of courage we applaud, which is not your kind of courage, right? He says it's a great deal to face torture and death when you know for a fact hatred and violence are empty things in themselves. It's a great deal to fight while despising war, to accept losing everything while still preferring happiness, to face destruction while still cherishing the idea of a higher civilization. And he says, you had nothing to conquer in your heart or your intelligence. We had two enemies. We actually had to work a lot harder than you. And so he talks about, there's two different words that get used here, overcoming. So in some of the passages, it's dominer, you could say to dominate, to be on top of, and then vaincre, to conquer as well. He goes on and he says that we had a lot of things that we did have to conquer, to beat. We had to overcome the constant temptation to emulate you, to say, well, it worked for them, let's do the same thing. This is, for any group that is being oppressed and attacked, it's an opportunity to get rid of their ideals and say, we need to be successful like those bad people over there. He says there's always something that yields to instinct, to contempt for intelligence, to the cult of efficiency. Our great virtues become tiresome to us, right? And he says we could imagine some barbarous state where truth would be effortless. But the cure for this is easy. You're there to show us what that would lead to. You are the model of that. So we don't want to resemble the enemy. He also talks about a suspicion, soupçon, of heroism. And that doesn't mean rejecting heroism altogether. It means a more realistic attitude about it. He says we profess heroism and we distrust it at the same time, which is probably the attitude we should have towards heroism. Why? Well, he says that 10 centuries of intelligence have taught us the art and blessings of being natural. In order to face up to you, we had to first be at death's door. That's why we fell behind, right? We were concerned with seeking truth, and we were defeated because we were concerned to determine in our hearts whether right was on our side. He also talks about overcoming a weakness for mankind. Now, weakness is probably a bit of a strong term here. It's goût de l'homme, so a taste, literally, for humanity, for remaining human, a wish to do so. He says this was an image that we had formed of a peaceful destiny, that deep-rooted conviction of ours, that no victory ever pays, whereas any mutilation of mankind is irrevocable. We had to give up all our knowledge and our hope, the reasons we had for loving and the loathing we had for all war, right? And then Camus says, okay, we actually did that. We had to make what he calls a long detour. So what is this long detour? The years of occupation. And what does this detour look like? He says it's a detour that regard for truth imposes on intelligence, so on the mind. You can't lie to yourself. That regard for friendship imposes on the heart. Friendship, amitié, caring for, loving another. And he says it's a detour that safeguarded justice and put truth on the side of those who question themselves. So this is all good stuff, right? But it doesn't come cheap. And he says that we paid a lot for it. With humiliations and silences, bitter experiences, prison sentences, executions at dawn, desertions, separations, daily pangs of hunger, emaciated children, and above all, with humiliation of our human dignity. Why would they do that? What was the point of that? Camus goes on to explain. He says it took all that time to find out if we had the right to kill men, if we were allowed to add to the frightful misery of this world. And then he says something really interesting. He talks about time lost, which makes perfect sense, but it's also time recaptured. So it wasn't just lost, right? And our defeat accepted, which of course they had to do, but surmounted. Those scruples paid for with blood, and he says, we French today have the right to think that we entered this war with hands clean. What kind of clean hands? Clean as the victims and the condemned are, and we will come out of this with a victory won against injustice and against ourselves. We had to overcome ourselves and not just the Germans in order to do that. And so he's going to talk about a long, slow progress during which we found our justification. So what justification? That they didn't give up on important values that allow you to call your country into question, that allow you to say, no, we're not going to go there. Even if it means that they're going to win. We will respect certain limits, certain boundaries. So he goes on and he says, to possess ourselves of the Spirit, we had to endure torture of the flesh. One really possesses only what one has paid for. We have paid dearly and we have not finished paying, but we have our certainties, our justifications, our justice. Your defeat is inevitable. Now remember, he's saying this in 1943, and not at the end of 1943, but in July 1943. So, to some degree, it looked like the Nazis, could still pull out some sort of victory. France had not been liberated at this time, but this is where he's thinking. And he goes on and he says something else that's really interesting here. I've never believed in the power of truth itself, but when expressed forcefully, truth wins out over falsehood. And he calls this a difficult equilibrium. So just having ideals, saying nice things, that's not going to do anything by itself. You do have to be willing to put yourself into the fray. But if you do that, you're going to beat the person who doesn't have anything like that, just violence, just rage, just a willingness to sacrifice others. Now, he says something really interesting to bring this to an end. So he tells us that France has a long road ahead of them. So France used to be one of the main world powers, and he says that France has lost her power and her sway for a long time to come. It's not just going to be, well, the Germans are out, now we restore ourselves, we got all of our colonies, we become, one of the most important nations again. He says, no, that's not going to happen. And he says for a long time, she's going to need a desperate patience. Why? Because it requires a patience to recover the element of prestige necessary for any culture. And so he says, I haven't lost hope. And this may actually throw some readers of Camus for a bit of a loop, because in the myth of Sisyphus, he very often talks against hope. But here he's saying hope is something that not only is good to have, in this case, I have it myself. And he says that I belong to an admirable and persevering nation, which, admitting her errors and weaknesses, has not lost the idea that constitutes her whole greatness. I belong to a nation which for the past 4 years has begun to relive the course of her entire history, and which is calmly and surely preparing out of the ruins to make another history and to take her chance in a game in which she holds no trumps, right? She doesn't have the top cards. And he says, this country is worthy, now what a beautiful phrase, of the difficult and demanding love that is mine. And I believe she is decidedly worth fighting for, because she's worthy of a higher love. So he's retorting to his German friend, yes, indeed, I do love my country. I love my country in a way that you not only cannot do, because you don't have the right kind of country to love, but you can't even really understand. I'm going to give you some of the elements, some of the lines that you could follow if you wanted to understand it, but you probably won't get it. And he says, I say that your nation has received from its sons only the love it deserved, which was blind. A nation is not justified by such love, right? So we've got not only nuances between two kinds of greatness, we've got two different kinds of love for one's country being expressed here, and an explanation of what really loving your country in a higher form would require, not just of the intellectual, but of anybody who would claim to love their country genuinely.